of Essex County Council and Hertfordshire County Councils. Together, in addition to that, there is also now a dedicated Garden Town team, to which my colleague Claire Hamilton, sat to my right, is the appointed director, and that team is growing and is taking on a number of specialisms in order to deliver the Garden Town and to ensure that the Garden City principles are brought forward and to really facilitate the joint working across the area.
Just pause for a second, Mr. Coleman. I'm just going to close the window. Mind. Thank you. I can hear the road as much as you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
No problem, thank you. I'll move on now to the concept and talking around the general concept and the relationship of the allocations. So just by way of clarification, the Gilston development is set out in the East Herts District Local Plan, and that plan has already been found sound and is now an adopted local plan. So the allocations that make up the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town are included within the three districts, East Herts, Harlow and Epping Forest. The new garden communities will be interrelated in a number of ways in order to ensure that a comprehensive and cohesive approach is taken to delivery. And it's very much the role of the officer groups, member boards and the Garden Town team to ensure that joint working to facilitate delivery. In addition to the Garden Town team, there are a large number of work streams that have been established across the project to facilitate the joint working that's required. So officers of the 5 councils work collectively to progress matters of delivery, stewardship and other associated issues. So in terms of joint working and connecting the sites, of particular importance is the approach to infrastructure provision and design, which will be coordinated across the sites that make up the Garden Town garden communities. However, this does not mean that the delivery of allocations themselves are interdependent. Individual site allocations will be capable of delivery regardless of progress on other sites. The policies of the plan provide adequate flexibility should the delivery of one site be delayed for any particular reason. In terms of the concept of the Garden Town itself and coherence between the Garden Town communities and Harlow, the Council has proposed a modification to paragraph 2.107 of the local plan submission version to make clear that the Garden Town comprises the whole of Harlow together with the 4 new garden communities. This is set out in the draft Statement of Common Ground with Essex County Council, and that's Appendix 2, ED 10B, page 18. Beyond this, the Council considers that the plan already sufficiently makes clear the need for coherence and integration between the Garden Town communities and Harlow itself. Specifically, Policy SP4 and the associated supporting text makes clear the need for development to be holistically planned and integrated. A similar policy is contained within the Harlow Development Plan in order to ensure a consistent approach, particularly for the East Harlow site, which straddles the 2 administrative areas. And as we'll come on to later, officers from Harlow District Council and Epping Forest District Council have worked together very closely in order to ensure a consistent approach to the development of policies relating to the Garden Town. Thank you.
Okay, if we can hear from others around the table who wish to speak on this matter. If you wish to speak on a particular matter, if you turn your board on its end, and then I'll know. Can I just ask, did the County Council, who'd expressed concerns, want to speak in relation to this matter? If you do, it might be helpful if you were to go first.
Certainly, thank you. Yes, I think it's important to state initially that the County Council is extremely supportive of the Garden Town as a concept and as a sustainable location for growth. Having said that, the way that the Garden Town is viewed, expressed and understood is equally seen as extremely important. There are a number of ways in which this is being set out through the local plans, as you've heard, and through a number of other collective Garden Town documents which are emerging and have a great importance for explaining the coherence and singularity of the Garden Town approach. Those include the Garden Town Vision, the Garden Town Design Guide, the Garden Town Emerging Infrastructure Delivery Plan, and the viability work. A lot of things like that at the moment that are extremely positive. Having said that, we feel that something has been lost within the wording, as has been expressed within the County Council statement, in that whilst trying to convey the fact that the Garden Town has to be seen as a single Garden Town community, which will consist of both the existing town of Harlow, as well as the new developments, the strategic developments that are being planned through the Epping Forest District Plan, as well as the other local plans. It's the expression of that concept that's extremely important to the County Council, and therefore the County Council has contended that if the individual developments themselves are seen as individual garden communities, then that loses the expression, the coherence and the clarity of the whole Garden Town as a single garden community. That's why the County Council put in these representations. There have been a number of discussions with both Epping Forest District Council as well as Harlow Council to try to find a clearer way of expressing this. Those discussions have not proved successful so far in terms of reaching a common agreement. The County Council is open to slightly different forms of wording in terms of things like neighbourhoods, as we've suggested, but I think that the important point is that if these developments are described as individual garden communities, then that's not going to be a clear enough message and understanding for the developers, landowners, site promoters, the actual private sector interests that will be responsible for actually delivering most of the developments, whilst accepting that the public sector will take the lead. We want to make sure that the promoters and developers do understand the single concept of the Garden Town as a single garden community.
Thank you. I know that I know that there's lots of things before me about modifications that are proposed, but there's a whole raft of them. So it would be helpful to me if you could. I mean, the council mentioned that it was proposing a modification to a particular paragraph. Perhaps if the council could take me to that or tell me what that is, and whether you agree that that would be sufficient, or indeed, if not, then what you would suggest as an alternative, and perhaps we could discuss that now. Did you mention 2.107, was it, that you mentioned?
Yes. I'm just going to find the draft statement of common ground, which I think will be best to refer to. Just bear with me. Okay, I've found it. Sorry, as you say, there's a lot of paperwork around this issue. So,
So
it's,
first of all, is this a statement of common ground that is signed and agreed, or is it still in draft?
no, it's a draft,
Draft.
statement of common ground, and the draft statement of common ground sets out areas which are resolved, and Appendix 2 is outstanding objections, and sets out the current position in relation to those objections. So this issue falls within Appendix 2. Page 18. Which is ED 10B. So there is a table there. This is under representation reference 14. And it sets out the position of Essex County Council and the position of Epping Forest District Council. So the proposed modification from Epping Forest District Council to paragraph 2.107 of the plan is that to change the text so it reads, Harlow in Garden Town comprises the whole of Harlow together with 4 new garden communities. So the new text is the whole of Harlow together with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay.
Essex County Council's position is that agreement has not yet been reached and a resolution is still required. However, Essex County Council welcomes the revision in principle. It is considered that this still contains ambiguity and does not yet provide a sufficiently clear expression of the coherence of a single Garden Town community concept and approach. Accordingly, Essex County Council proposes a suggested form of revised wording and will send this to the councils for review. It is suggested that the wording of this description of the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town might take the form of the following. Paragraph 2.107, Harlow and Gilston Garden Town comprises the whole of Harlow, together with 4 new neighbourhoods planned on garden community principles as follows. So the difference is essentially in that sentence.
So the difference seems to be in the wording using the word neighbourhoods. Is that the essential difference?
Yes, I'll just read it again. So
Yeah.
Epping's wording is Harlow and Gilston Garden Town comprises the whole of Harlow together with 4 new garden communities. And then it lists those. The wording suggested from Essex County Council is Harlow and Gilston Garden Town comprises the whole of Harlow together with 4 new neighbourhoods planned on garden community principles as follows, and then lists the 4.
So
communities.
so it seems that there's broad agreement to reflect the relationship with the whole of Harlow. Is the disagreement now limited to the use of the term neighbourhoods as well as or as instead of garden communities? How fundamental is that? Is it more than just a wording issue?
It's one of those things, I think at first glance it could seem like something and nothing, but when you actually look at this and consider it a little bit further and ensure that the plan is sufficiently clear for users beyond those involved with the Garden Town directly, the public sector, the councils and the Garden Town team, then the importance really kicks in. So I think it really does hinge on the use of that word Garden Town communities rather than something else which reflects the coherence of the single Garden Town. So I think it can be boiled down to the use of that word, but also I think that the County Council feels that the wording we've proposed does express the whole idea and singularity in a preferable way and avoids that ambiguity.
So if your wording was used that used the word neighbourhoods and communities, your objection would be resolved, essentially, yes?
The word neighbourhoods was used instead of communities, yes. And also we've got the reference in there to garden community principles to reflect the TCPA principles.
In that respect, is the district council fundamentally against the use of the word neighbourhoods?
Not only because the plan refers to Garden Town communities, and there are 3 Garden Town communities, SP 5.1, 5.2 and 5.3. And I think it's important that we use consistent terminology. I don't think we're disagreeing with any of the aspirations and the aims. I think we're absolutely aligned. But we just feel it would be slightly confusing to change the terminology to neighbourhoods when we've referred to Garden Town communities throughout the plan and throughout other documentation. I would also add it's not something of great significance as far as from our perspective, as far as the plan moving forward. We don't wish to sort of hold things up unnecessarily, but we just feel it's more of a matter of consistency.
Okay, well, I think we certainly need to agree for now that there's a modification required to paragraph 2.107. Certainly the text about it referring to the whole of Harlow should be in there, and as I think you already have anyway, the use of the word communities. You've heard the County Council's position on having text in there around unity on the Garden Town principles and its desire for the use of the term neighbourhoods. If you can give consideration to those, and as close as you could come together in order to resolve an objection, I think so much the better.
Yes, I mean, I would reiterate discussions are ongoing. We would hope to have had agreement for you today, but obviously we haven't been able to discuss matters recently because of the hearing. So
no,
I'm quite sure we
but
can.
It sounds like you're on the same page, and
Absolutely.
I can see where you're coming from, and I do think it's very important to use consistent terminology. But given that this is a paragraph of the supporting text, if you're not absolutely against their suggestion, it seems to me that you could come to some agreement to resolve an objection.
We're very happy to take that away and to do so.
Thank you. Okay. Anything else? Let's hear from Mr. Smith.
Thank you, ma'am. The Epping Society is very concerned about this, not just on the point of semantics and a letter between the two councils agreeing what they think the word should say. We think it's the fundamental issue of whether these really are communities which are being proposed. Are they self-sustaining? Are they indeed communities? We rather view them more as suburbs or urban sprawl from Harlow, and that's the last thing we would want to see. And just having a form of words which keeps the officials at the two councils happy is not, it seems to us, a sufficient solution. Perhaps that isn't what's going to come out, but we are very concerned about that aspect. We think these either need to be self-sustaining communities in themselves, so they can be called garden villages in themselves, and we don't think they are from the plans we've seen so far, or else they're going to become an integral part of Harlow. And we're not convinced that's going to happen either. So we're very concerned about the reality, not just an exchange of letters and a statement of common ground which sort of covers over the words. We hope we're not being too negative in taking that view, but we are concerned about it. We think there's a real issue here, not just a set of words. We're rather concerned about the whole concept of garden villages. We actually think it's a good idea, and perhaps there are other places in the Epping Forest District where they could have been used, but these ones don't seem to be really integrated either with Harlow or with East Herts or with the FDC. They seem to be just blobs put around to satisfy a housing need, which happen to be close to Harlow. We're also
could you perhaps explain why you feel that, rather than just that is your concern? What is it that's missing?
They are remote from any core of Harlow. Harlow itself is already a pretty low density development as far as we can see. There are very large open spaces already for people in the different parts of Harlow, the different estates of Harlow. It's a long way for them to get to anything you could call the heart or centre of Harlow, and that's exacerbated by poor transport. So, we see it as people living in areas already in Harlow which are quite remote from the centre of Harlow, and these will just be the same thing all over again. We fear, and we would certainly want that not to happen. Well, if these are to be communities, they should either be self-sustaining in themselves, and people should look upon Gilston as being where they live, or if Gilston is to be part of the larger community of Harlow, then they need to be able to access Harlow more easily and see Harlow as where they live and be part of that. We fear there'll be neither, and therefore it will not be a community. And indeed, if you go back to what James Brokenshire said, I mean, he said that he wanted these communities to help local authorities build strong and vibrant communities where people want to live, work and raise families. We're not convinced that these garden villages in themselves do that, and we're not sure we see how those garden villages achieve that in relation to Harlow either. So we're not sure that's being met. Now, we are not experts. We don't have the resource to look into this, which the councils do, but we are very anxious about that, and we're very anxious about the community aspect of that. We think it's an important part of housing development on this scale. We're also a bit concerned that the idea of going down the garden village route was decided and introduced in early 2017, and there was no local consultation about that. The people of Epping Forest weren't asked, and let's face it, these are on Epping Forest land or East Herts land, albeit they are very close to Harlow. We weren't really asked about this. It was just done, and we're now presented it as a fait accompli, and we're asked to comment on it in the submission version of the local plan. We don't think that's really a very good way of going about it, and we sort of protest for that reason. I don't know whether this is the time to mention it, but we also don't feel that sufficient work has been done on these garden towns, or these garden villages, and the effect that they will have on Epping Forest, specifically Epping. I mean, Epping is the most northern of the main communities in Epping Forest district, and we fear that the travel and transport from these new developments will have a major impact on Epping, because many of the people in them will want to access the central line, because it is so much cheaper to travel on the central line than the main lines from the Harlow stations. And we foresee a very large increase in traffic coming through our town, which we can't cope with. We're already overwhelmed at rush hour time. We don't see that as having been studied. The transport and travel studies which have been done don't come this far north. They stop pretty much at Wake Arms. And we think this could be quite a major impact. We would like to see something more done to encourage people from these new garden villages to travel via the mainline stations in Harlow, but we don't really see anything effective being put forward to that effect. The idea that people are going to cycle the long distances involved from some of these to the stations, we also think highly unrealistic. So that also, we think, is not being sufficiently thought through to make them sustainable. And the last point we'd make is that while we actually are quite sympathetic to the idea of garden villages, we think they are an attractive way of building larger new housing areas and can work. We also think that more work should have been done to find out whether greater density could have been achieved in Harlow, as we also think in Epping Forest. It appears to us that Harlow is a relatively low density development town, and it is simply sprawling more and more across the Essex countryside, when actually what should be done is to increase the density of development within Harlow and use the existing resources better and give people easier access to the facilities of Harlow, as we also think within the communities of Epping Forest, but we're talking about Harlow here.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Stamp.
Thank you. I've mentioned at least as far back as Regulation 19 statement, objection, the comparisons with Church Langley. And Mr. Hill at Matter 4 said that Church Langley had progressed through to the plan at that stage to become Church Langley, and drawing parallels with Latin Priory south of Harlow. I can see the integration of most of the garden communities around Harlow with Harlow. I think Latin Priory is a rather different case. Looking at Church Langley and how that has developed, Harlow 10 years ago saw that as a completely separate entity to Harlow itself. It functioned differently. It's got its own petrol station, yes, a petrol station, at the entrance to Harlow, its own supermarket. Now it's got its own Premier Inn. Fairly self-contained, and the characterisation was a lot of people lived there, worked somewhere else, and came back there at night. They could have been attached to Harlow or any other town in the vicinity near the motorway network. If you actually look at the method of travel to work stats, the number of people from Church Langley, I'm taking an example, and I'll give you reasons why in a minute. The number of people travelling to work in Harlow, 28%. For the rest of Harlow's population, excluding Church Langley, a rather more respectable 45%. Okay, work journeys aren't all the journeys. They're internal journeys, but quite a lot of those are made by car within Church Langley, primary school pickups and that kind of stuff from observation. So there's a big difference between Church Langley and its integration with Harlow. If you just take work as a good example, a lot of people go to work 5 days a week. There's a big difference, 28% to 45%. If you look at physical proximity, from the entrance to Church Langley, the petrol station, I think that's significant. You put that right next to Church Langley, it shows where people can go. It's 2 miles on a good day, 5 minutes down the eastern side of Harlow, A414, to M11 Junction 7. From the new link road being proposed for Lappin Priory onto London Road, 0.6 miles, depending on which way you're going down the M11, a couple of minutes if it's clear, particularly if you're starting early enough in the morning. So that's shows Church Langley, quite close to the motorway network. The link road from Lappin Priory, very close to the M11. If you want to go to the M25, where you join it by the M11, 5 miles, 7 minutes on a good day. If you want to go to Epping Station, 6 miles roughly. A bit more if you have to find somewhere to park around there. 6 minutes on a clear journey, starting off early enough in the morning to catch perhaps the early tube starting at 5 o'clock. I can see Lappin Priory functioning entirely differently than the other garden communities, which I think there is prospects of integration, physically, transport, landscape-wise. But on all those, not Lappin Priory. We'll obviously come on to the practicalities, viability and feasibility of transport links. I'd suggest certainly not more detailed bits. But that's just to flag up, really. I see Church Langley working as completely different. I don't see it as a community of Harlow. It will be, I could see a lot of people buying a house there because it's got good car access, depending on, no matter what public transport is put in or not.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor.
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to reiterate what's been said earlier on by the previous speaker, not the one that's just spoken. I don't know his name at the end there, but
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Smith, more or less would say exactly what the Harlow Alliance Party would say about these proposals in terms of communities, whether they are communities. As the previous gentleman just said as well, I think each section of this can be taken individually as to what the issues are, and I think we're coming on to them later on today at each individual site, so I won't go into that. But clearly the residents of Harlow have not been consulted about these plans. The suggestion of changes today have not been consulted with. You have our submission about that. It's going to be interesting to see these sort of discussions at the Harlow local plan hearings, which are taking place very soon now, and we are making representations there. Just to give an example of that is that the Garden Town did a consultation last Saturday week in the Harvey Centre. They were able to say that 16,000 people had been written to. It was pointed out that there's 37,000 houses in Harlow. But there was no mention on those plans of the effect it will have on Harlow and its infrastructure. And quite clearly, all what we've said so far today affects Harlow. But Harlow people have not been consulted about most of what's being discussed at these hearings. I have to say it's a very political hot potato in Harlow. It's being supported by the Labour group in the council, but it's not being supported by at least part of the Conservative group in the council. And they feel that the future of Harlow will be decided in the council chamber in Harlow, rather than necessarily at these hearings, in practical terms. We've been speaking to Conservative councillors only in the last few days, and they clearly have great concerns about a number of the elements of the Epping plan and how it affects Harlow. So I'll stop there, but there's a heck of a lot more I could be saying, and some of that will certainly come out this afternoon.
Thank you. I know that there's a couple of other boards up around the table, but I don't know whether or not the representatives from Harlow Council would be willing to perhaps offer a comment on what we've just heard. It did come up to some extent on day one when we were talking about this sort of the fairness and the consultation processes. But I don't know whether it puts you on the spot a little bit, but I don't know whether you're able to say something about how the issues that have been addressed here have been dealt with by Harlow Council.
Thanks, ma'am. I mean, the whole process, we have to obviously step back a bit and look at the identification of the housing need, which I know has been considered previously. So the whole plan-making process does go back over 8 or so years. In fact, if you go back, even further, the spatial strategy that's been examined for the Harlow area now, it was an approach that was being promoted through the old regional plan, because Harlow, irrespective of what the housing number ultimately would be, was seen as a sustainable location for growth, given the range of facilities it currently offers and which will continue to do so in the future. So the housing need, in terms of what's been identified through the joint SHMA, has been set out in the various consultation stages of our local plan, and indeed obviously through Epping's local plan as well, over a sort of a 7 or 8 year period. So we looked at obviously the broad housing needs, as well as other needs across Harlow and the wider area, including employment. We looked at obviously the population growth, which informed the preparation of the SHMA, and then that was taken forward in the identification of appropriate sites, and both Epping and Harlow had undertaken joint work to consider the most appropriate sites in and around the Harlow area. These and particularly are the strategic sites. And that was manifest in our last consultation, where we, previous consultations, both at Issues and Options and Reg 19, which set out broad locations for growth based upon the evidence. So, as I say, in terms of detailed work in respect of individual sites, we also understand developers have obviously been promoting these sites and have undertaken some of their own engagement exercises. But as I say, the council's position is that it's been over an 8 or so year period. We've got to the stage where our plan was submitted based upon the identified housing needs across the Harlow area, and indeed the strategic sites which could help deliver that housing need. But of course, the strategic sites and the consultations that relate to them are not just part of the local plan making process. They do relate to once applications are submitted through the preparation of master plans and indeed the consideration of the development proposals being promoted by developers, gives a clear opportunity for the community to be more specifically involved in the detail. I've heard a comment made about the lack of detail. Well, at this strategic stage, you know, the detail is still being developed and identified, but obviously through the master planning process, in conjunction with engaging with the community by the respective councils in the future, that we will obviously identify the best spatial locations for elements of the strategic sites, be it the housing, the linkages between the existing neighbourhoods, provision of schools, etc. And as I'm sure we'll discuss later, this is ongoing work, which hasn't been, which has not been complete.
Thank you. Just to seek clarity on one thing you said, I think you said in your own plans, the sort of broad locations for growth have been made clear. In your own consultations, was it clear? Would it have been clear to people that some of the broad locations for the growth of Harlow were outside of the administrative boundary? Were they shown, or was it just the boundary, and you only showed what was within Harlow's administrative boundary itself?
No, the consultations identified that there was growth being proposed across the wider Harlow area, because obviously the SHMA identified that both, not just Epping, but East Hertfordshire District Council, were looking and seeking to deliver growth. So hence East Hertfordshire's plan, which is obviously in advance of both Epping's and Harlow's plan, did set out a strategy there for Gilston. So, it wasn't as if Harlow is considering its growth in isolation.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Mr. Spencer.
Thank you, Ma'am. You won't be surprised to hear that I disagree with Mr. Smith's comments. It's certainly my client's position that we believe there'd be a significant degree of self-sufficiency at the east of Harlow Garden Town community. And as an example of that, you only have to look at the education uses, the local centres, the potential employment, with the relocation of the hospital, and the various forms of open space that are allocated in the respective local plan policies. But as well as having a degree of self-sufficiency, we believe that actually the site is well connected to the town. It's less than 2 miles from Harlow Mill Station, and together with the town centre, they'll be connected to the site via the County Council's proposals for a new east-west sustainable transport corridor. So we feel the site benefits from both self-sufficiency and also future connections to existing parts of the town.
Mr. Hill.
Thank you, ma'am. Just standing back from some of the comments that have been made and looking more broadly at what this plan has got to do, As you'll be very well aware, and the council are very well aware, the task is to find sustainable locations for many, many thousands of new homes within what is a small rural greenbelt authority, heavily constrained by other factors such as its ecology. It, as you know, wraps around Harlow. Indeed, Harlow was carved out of the previous Epping rural area. It's inconceivable that Epping Forest District Council needs could be met, in our view, without linking to Harlow in some way, by far and away the largest settlement in the locality. And we say, as you will have seen from our submissions, that Latton Priory, of the Garden Town sites, is by far and away the best located area to plug into the existing infrastructure of Harlow. And you'll see that on the ground, ma'am, if you haven't done so already. Thank you.
Thank you. If we hear from Mr. Jackson, and then I'm keen to move on to issue 2 if we can. Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Madam. Picking up the point that the gentleman on my right, 2 down, made regarding distances from Latton Priory, the access road proposed is about 3 miles north of Epping Underground Station, which is a terminus. The local plan makes no provision for any increase in parking. In fact, the reverse, it proposes parking on a level above the underground station car park. At the moment, it's well beyond capacity and the town cannot cope.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. If I ask the council to come back on the points that have been raised so far as it wants to. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. I do have a couple of points I wanted to make. Thank you for the opportunity. Just in terms of engagement and consultation with the local community, obviously you've heard from colleagues at Harlow about the work that's been undertaken over the years, and I agree. You know, it's been a very long period of plan progression, joint working, and the sites that are identified in the Epping Forest Plan and in the Harlow Plan are not a surprise. They've been around for a long time. In terms of engagement and consultation throughout the process, I don't want to list details, but just in terms of the draft local plan consultation, which was the Regulation 18 consultation, the council did, through the 6-week consultation period in October to December 2016, we did hold specific exhibitions within Harlow itself at the Latton Bush Centre. We've not been sort of blind to the fact that consultation needs to stop and only take place within Epping itself. You know, clearly we acknowledge that these developments will impact upon Harlow, and therefore it's important to gather the wider views. And the proposals have been publicised at various stages. And then in terms of, that's set out in our consultation statement if you want to see that, which is EB 115, specifically page 8. And then just going to the point around Latton Priory and general integration, we're going to come on to this, I know, throughout the day, but it's very much the case that the proposals will need to be fully integrated into the town centre of Harlow, and sustainable transport corridors are absolutely crucial to achieving that, and achieving the modal shift that we recognise is required to bring forward these developments in a sustainable way. So whilst they are referred to as communities, they're very much linked in with Harlow itself and linking in with the existing services and facilities. And indeed, one of the drivers for the proposed growth is actually trying to stimulate the regeneration and economic growth of Harlow itself. And that links very much to the wider aspirations of the London Stansted Cambridge, sorry, did I say that the right way? London Stansted Cambridge Consortium and the corridor. Just in terms of Latton Priory as well, we recognise, you heard from the Epping Society about the issues of car parking in Epping itself and the impact of traffic congestion. We certainly recognise those problems. and we are continuing to work with the County Council in order to try and address the impacts of the growth on neighbouring areas. The County Council have raised concerns about the impacts of growth on Epping and at North Weald as well. And we've been in continuing dialogue with them on these issues, and as a result we have proposed some further modifications to the plan, specifically in relation to the need for sustainable transport choices linking into Epping and North Weald as well. So they're set out in the summary update position paper to the draft statement of common ground, which is in our evidence base. I don't have a reference number to hand, I'm afraid, but that's been with you or that has been provided to you fairly recently. Thank you.
Just so I know, for when I come to it, will they be relevant to the place sessions? Yeah.
Very much so, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. We'll move on now to issue 2. Which on my MIQs was, are the Garden Town allocations deliverable in respect of their impact on transport infrastructure? But I intend perhaps on this agenda, if there are comments that people want to make in relation to either infrastructure more generally, transport infrastructure and viability, then this would be the section to do so. I will split up the bullet points slightly here. Perhaps if we talk first about the first one, the progress with the IDP, the Infrastructure Delivery Plan, and the viability study. Now, I've said here, does the plan contain adequate reference to these documents, and is their intended status clear and justified? Now, we did discuss this on Tuesday in the context of a more general session on viability in relation to paragraph 57 of the new National Planning Policy Framework. Now, my understanding, the Council correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's the Council's intention or preference to get these 2 documents to a point where they can be reflected in the local plan and relied upon for the purpose of triggering that paragraph 57 of the NPPF. Now, concerns were expressed about that around the table. I don't want to open up the whole, I've taken the points around the table, I don't want to open up the whole discussion about that again, but as we are here about the garden towns in particular, if there are garden town specific concerns that people want to raise, then do so. Be useful perhaps to hear from Harlow and Essex County Council as well about how they feel about the progress of that document and whether it would provide sufficient evidence for us to be able to rely for viability assessment on the plan rather than at the detailed planning application stage. So if we can discuss that now, but as I say, we did hear a lot about that on Tuesday, so I don't want to hear any general points about that again. Thank you. Did the Council want to begin?
Thank you, Madam. So just in terms of just brief scene setting, I think given that we've got some new people around the table, as you'll be aware, the Council has submitted an update on the progress of the Garden Town IDP and Viability Study. That's ED9. Harlow District Council has also submitted a similar update to their local plan examination, which is currently ongoing. So the Garden Town IDP and Viability Study are being produced by the Garden Town partner authorities. The work draws together previous studies undertaken by the councils and other stakeholders. In particular, the work builds upon the 3 infrastructure delivery plans produced by East Herts District Council, Epping Forest District Council, and Harlow District Council. However, the infrastructure required to support the delivery of the Garden Town sites is already sufficiently identified and set out within respective infrastructure delivery plans, and the viability of these requirements is assessed through district-level viability studies in order to inform and support local plans. But the production of the Garden Town IDP and viability studies recognises the need to coordinate the planning and the planning and delivery of complex strategic infrastructure over the entire plan period and beyond, across the entirety of the Garden Town. Since the time of the update, ED9, the studies have progressed considerably, and the process of stakeholder engagement has recently been completed, enabling the reports to be finalised. It is anticipated that the 2 documents will be completed and ready for publication by the week commencing the 15th of April 2019. This would mean that the documents would be available prior to the deadline for the submission of hearing statements for matter 14 on infrastructure and delivery, which is Thursday the 25th of April. As I outlined on behalf of the Council earlier this week at the Matter 5 hearing session, the Council does consider that whilst the updated evidence in the form of the Garden Town IDP and viability study is not required in order to find the plan sound under paragraphs 173 and 174 of the NPPF 2012, the updated evidence will form a crucial material consideration to inform emerging strategic master plans across the Garden Town, and in due course the determination of planning applications for the sites. And as you've referenced, this is particularly important given the provisions of paragraph 57 of the new NPPF. With this in mind, the Council proposes amendments to the plan to make the status and role of the emerging IDP and viability evidence clear, and also to reflect any conclusions or recommendations arising from the work. Thank you.
Okay, we hear from others around the table. Start with Mr. Smith.
Ma'am, I'd like to protest. All this week we've been hearing from EFDC about the documents they intend to publish the week beginning the 15th of April. That's very close to the last set of hearings of this inspection. The amount of effort it takes for a voluntary society like ours to try to keep up with the documents that are coming out of EFDC during the course of these hearings makes it almost impossible for us to make reasonable comments about the proposals. Some of these are pretty fundamental. Earlier in the week we were told about documents coming out to do with the community infrastructure levy and all that sort of thing, and the IDP. Now we've got another one which is described as crucial to understanding the Garden Towns. I don't know how many documents there are which are coming out now and how many are yet to come out. There seem to be an awful lot of them. As a society, we simply can't keep on top of them. And indeed, I'd comment that sometimes when we go and look for things which are mentioned here, we find it difficult to find them on the website.
Mr. Cook.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Just to respond to the invitation to comment on the emerging Garden Town viability and IDP work, I'd just like to make a few main points around that. I'll be as brief as possible. Just like to say that the County Council is supporting that work and sees it as a very good and effective form of cooperative joint working across all the partner local authorities involved. It is, of course, a large undertaking and a complex piece of work, and I think that explains why perhaps it hasn't been completed quite as of yet at this point in time. But having said that, the County Council and I believe the other authorities are happy with both the form of the work, the approach to it, and the progress so far, and it's moving forward now quite successfully. The intention, of course, as has been alluded to, is for the work to be NPPF and National Planning Policy Guidance compliant, and therefore to satisfy the new requirements of the 2019 NPPF in respect of placing the onus of viability work in particular at the plan making stage. So therefore the County Council would commend the work and feel that this is going to be an extremely positive addition to both the local plans and the Garden Town more widely. And therefore, having heard what Epping Forest has said about proposed amendments to the local plan in respect of reference in this work, I think the County Council would be very supportive of that type of amendment in principle.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Sorry, I can't see your name that far away. Forgione. It's Forgione. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Inspector. I just wanted to reiterate what Essex County Council and Epping Council have said, that I fully support both of those statements in regards to the IDP and viability work. We too have had similar questions that are going to be asked of us at our examination on the purposes of those two documents. I understand people's frustrations that they have come late, but they are extremely technical. They have taken quite a bit of time to prepare, and they are thorough as well. We will be making similar amendments to our plan to refer to both documents, and like Epping Council has said, they are NPPF and NPPG compliant, including the most updated NPPF in respect of viability. So I just wanted to set out our support of both councils' comments.
Thank you. Perhaps again to put you on the spot, and also Essex County Council, I'll ask the council to come back. If you could maybe just comment on the sort of procedural issue raised by Mr. Smith. If these are sort of being put forward as quite fundamental documents, do you think that there is sufficient time within the examination process for all parties? Obviously, we'll hear from the developers, I expect, in a moment, but also these sort of smaller societies, if you like, to be able to digest them and to make their views known if needs be. Could I ask Harlow how you intend to deal with it?
Yes, so our local plan is already supported by an infrastructure delivery plan and a viability study. The Harlow infrastructure delivery plan sought to identify infrastructure items not just for the sites in Harlow but also the strategic sites, the Garden Town communities that were coming forward across the Garden Town as well. So it has given an indication of the level of infrastructure required across the entire area because of the connections between those sites and the infrastructure, facilities and services in the Harlow urban area as well. So they have been made public and published alongside our Regulation 19 local plan. And again, we do have viability work to demonstrate that our local plan is viable and in respect of the strategic site east of Harlow as well. We have, as Epping Council said, let our inspector know of the publication of that document, and yes, it is after our hearing sessions have ended. We hope that what that IDP will do is update our existing IDP and sit alongside it. So it is a material consideration. It will continuously be updated as new information is provided. So we see it as an iterative process, and hopefully in the way that we have agreed to prepare it and publish it, that it will be very easy for people to read and understand and look at how we've apportioned costs as well.
Did Essex County Council want to comment on that point?
I think the one thing that we would add to that to elucidate is the fact that the IDP has to be seen as a snapshot at a point in time, so it reflects the latest available, best available information as of now. But the really important point is that this is actually going to be a live document. So it will be updated, added to, enhanced, refined, etc. over the course of time, but it will be a live document, so people can see the progress and where it is now, but they will also perhaps want to keep track of it in the future, because the IDP will need updating as and when important infrastructure items are funded and delivered, and different kinds of infrastructure requirements are identified or refined over the course of time. So it has to be seen as a live document.
Thank you. Did you want to comment now, or did you want to wait until we've heard from everybody else? Comment now on that point.
I'll just comment briefly on that point. I agree with what my colleagues from Essex County Council and Harlow have said. And I would reiterate that we don't think that the evidence is crucial in terms of finding the local plan, this local plan sound under the MPPF. Indeed, obviously this is equally as important for East Herts District Council, whose plan is already adopted. This is very much us taking on best practice and making sure that we can have the best possible position as partner authorities across the Garden Town to provide comfort to local communities that the infrastructure will be provided, that needs to be provided, and to provide very clear guidance to the developers as to what's going to be required of them and how funding will be secured, and also how that will still result in viable schemes. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Barber.
Ma'am, thank you very much. Just a small point. That point of clarification was most helpful. In the context of the Water Lane site, who are about to enter into their Strategic Master Plan Quality Review programme, where that programme could throw up all sorts of issues that currently we're not aware of. So being a live document, being a document that is updated regularly is clearly going to be important. An application could be some 18 months to 2 years away, in which time those assumptions made in the IDP could have changed. Funding streams could have changed in that timescale. And it's important, I think, from our perspective that whilst I understand the Council's desire to reflect paragraph 57 of the latest NPPF, under the current guidance, that's not a paragraph that is necessarily relevant to the consideration of this plan. We're broadly supportive and have participated in the IDP consultation process. We've made substantive representations to that and have broad agreement with that. But it's the flexibility element that, given the process that we're about to enter into, that we are concerned with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Ma'am, I've just heard what's been said, and it seems that the three councils are being mutually supportive on this. But just to recall that Mr. Coleman did refer to one of the documents that is yet to come out as being crucial, and Harlow referred to one of their documents as a material consideration. I would just like to emphasise that the public locally are not confident that the council have got a grip on the infrastructure that's required. We see our infrastructure already as being straining beyond its capacity, and we are not at all confident that sufficient infrastructure will be implemented to match the additional housing. So to tell us that we have to take this on trust, that the document is an evolving document, that we'll hear about it in due course after the inspection has been completed, is asking us to take too much on trust.
Just so I'm clear on your position, Mr. Smith, what do you think should, obviously what's been proposed here is that you'll have the opportunity to look at the documents before the closing date for the statements for the session on infrastructure. Obviously you're saying you don't think that would be adequate. What would be necessary in your view?
To have done this some months ago.
On the basis that that isn't possible, what would be your view as to what should happen now?
I've never dealt with an inspection like this before, so it's difficult to know what sort of answer is reasonable, but certainly we need enough time between these documents becoming available and the next set of hearings so we can go through them. I don't know how many pages there will be in these. Many council documents are hundreds of pages long. I don't know whether we're talking about hundreds of new pages or hundreds of amended pages, or are we talking about a few dozen pages? If it's the latter, then I expect we can get through it. If it's hundreds of pages in new documents, we won't be able to get through it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Stamp.
Thank you. I also see a problem with the lack of the information which is available to justify the allocations and their locations. You look at the overall IDP, and it is abundantly obvious where things have been costed. They haven't all. There is rather a lack of detail on when the money's going to come from. Developer contributions. I can't see anyone adding those up to see whether they are likely to be viable to underpin some of the allocations. Some might be more viable than others. I can see north of Harlow as a large number of thousands of new homes, the potential add to a few thousand, to be more viable on greenfield land values to put in the infrastructure. On other ones, I don't know. We don't know. I see the lack of the overall IDP information as causing a problem. I see the ED9 all page and a bit of it, as I found, which just seems to say there's a lot of stuff which is missing. I've looked at conflicts between the information which is available. I've looked at the overall IDP, which reflects, for example, new busway services providing a route Rye Hill London Road. That's down as essential. Then that conflicts with what the draft transport strategy for the Harlow and Gilston Garden towns says. which also conflicts with what the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town vision document, both those two latter ones being provided in about February, says. So I don't even know exactly which bits are going to be costed. Some of those are purely impractical, as we'll come on to this afternoon. I mean, really, I hesitate to think if that's the kind of planning which is going into some of this, I worry. So, yes, I'll deal later with some of the deliverable aspects. But the kind of assurance one might get that overall this is what we need to do, this is what it's going to cost, developers can probably put in so much, just appears to be lacking. And lastly, just, I'll probably mention it later just in case I forget, under the ACOM work on Latin Priory, looked at the green belt and recommended against Latin Priory, also Rye Hill Common, being developed. But then, as long as it was going to pay for a north-south public transport link, then that might be allowable. That's okay on that basis. But now we don't know whether it is. The developer's statement says, well, we're not going to pay for all of it. If they are going to be paid for other bits, you can't, there's so many bits which are going, you can't say.
If you just hold that thought for a moment, because if I take the rest of the comments that are around the table now in relation to the sort of more general issue of the IDP, I've then, as you can see on the agenda, I've got some specific questions that hopefully we can deal with just in relation to particular parts of infrastructure that I was unsure about, and the corridors will come up in that. So if I, is it Mr. Leverett? Mr. Leverett, please.
I'm going to reiterate what's just been said, though, in terms of the infrastructure plans. There's two infrastructure plans, one for Epping, which is done by Atkins, I think, and the other one's over Arup, done by Harlow Council. They conflict, and there's the amounts of money that they're talking about getting from developers. In the Epping, well, I think it was 50 million, and in the Harlow was 108 million, which is, and that's only the first guess. And this sustainable transport route is, I'll be told by Harlow Council, is going to be a tramway, and that's what's been said by the portfolio holder in Harlow. So that was news to us, and it's whether it's sustainable to be able to get this housing on each side. It's sustainable to be actually build this, and they said it's an essential part of the infrastructure strategy, but it's whether they can get this sort of money off of developers.
Mr. Dagley and then Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Madam. Just a few points to make my points once. I think clearly the Conservatives are very concerned about the southward movement of traffic that's potentially going to come from Water Lane and Latin Priory in particular. And we've made representations about that, which we can perhaps explore further. I think the first point to make, we're clearly seeing some iterative work on the IDP, which is interesting. It's useful to hear what's been said this morning, but I just wanted to flag up that clearly there needs also to be an iterative approach to the habitats regulation assessment and the appropriate assessment within that to understand what the impacts of each of these new changes to the IDP might be. The HRA clearly has not yet caught up with them as far as we're aware. That was the first point. The second point on the general issue, particularly with Latin Priory in the north-south corridor, we've made the point about clearly these things need to be in place prior to development, and it's good to see that reflected in the on page 8 of the EFDC Matter 8 statement. However, it clearly, as far as I can make out from EB 1408, which I've only looked at relatively briefly, which is the transport plan for Harlow, and the links with the Latin Priory and Water Lane. This aim of modal shift is aimed at journeys across Harlow. I think the key issue that, as far as I can see, has not been answered is how, what are the viable alternatives that are going to be created to private car use for out commuting. We've heard about some of these issues going south to get to the central line through Epping, even to Thaden Boys. This out commuting is an issue. There's a map on page 15 of EB 1408 which shows this potential sustainable corridor to Epping, which obviously is being worked on and clearly needs to be understood better, at least from our point of view. But it's not clear how that's going to be made up of and how that's going to be sustained, particularly given there are very limited bus services in Epping Forest District Council at the moment. And that, establishing that modal shift, we need those changes of behaviour to be entrenched before the road improvements. And again, it seems here that there will be a road improvement to junction 7 of the M11 and to the B1393. And if that's established, that could just simply exacerbate car use heading southwards to the Wake Arms roundabout and, of course, to the centre of Epping Forest SAC. So that's a general concern about how they're going to be dealt with, and particularly that's Latin Priory. But looking at Water Lane, the map in EB 1408 on page 15, it's clearly aimed at getting sustainable transport links in and across Harlow. That's what the purple arrows are suggesting. It's silent at the moment on the roads to the south, which is the B181 and the B182. And they, of course, lead directly to the 1393 into junctions close to or even on forest land, which have been listed in the IDP document EB 1101A and EB 1101B as being required, as, or at least as desirable, that these junction improvements take place. And that's to accommodate traffic, no doubt, heading south from Water Lane. There doesn't seem to be any sustainable transport offer to the south, at least, of Water Lane. So that's, if you like, an open question of mine, what exactly will happen with Water Lane. And that comes at the heart of whether that's integrated into Harlow sufficiently. That comes to a more specific point, I think, which is in our representation, we talked about there was this desirable option on one of the on one of the roads, the Rye Hill Road. It's down as EPP 22 in the delivery schedule of the IDP Part B. That's EB 1101B on page 46. Now, it says there that the aim would be, and this is dealing with Latin Priory, that would be improved traffic management and provision of alternative route away from Rye Hill Road, because this road connects directly to the 1393. And in discussions with Essex County Council, it's clear they're aware that that might lead to a rat run, which will lead to traffic coming south to Epping Forest and the Wake Arms roundabout. I've got two issues on it. We've said that rather than desirable, that needs to be essential, that closure, to prevent traffic heading south. But of course, the one problem with that is that there's a road linking to the junction 7 from Latin Priory, which is where also the sustainable transport corridor might come. But that simply reopens the route and makes it probably more efficient to get from Latin Priory south by car into the forest. So I'm unclear as to how the improved traffic management, apart from perhaps improving cycling links along the Rye Hill Road, will actually make any real inroad or change to out commuting and more traffic heading south through the forest to get to the M25 and of course to the City of London. I think they're all the points I need to make at the moment. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Hill.
Ma'am, I only wanted to make a few very generalised points at this stage, and I could see you were going to come to the details of the STCs and other matters later on in the agenda, so I'm just going to confine myself to some very broad points, if I may. First, the plan is, of course, being examined under transitional arrangements against the 2012 framework, and that's a fixed point which cannot move. Second, we understand the complexity of producing the Garden Towns IDP. We fully understand that. It's a joint exercise with a number of authorities involved, and we don't blame Epping Forest for the fact that this has taken some time to emerge, but nonetheless, it is going to be emerging into the public arena midway through April. We don't object to that, but we say that it is inevitably late in the process, and there will be a limited opportunity for participants to take it on board and scrutinise it in any level of detail. And third and last, we say we believe that there is enough material before you to enable you to reach the sort of broad judgment about the viability of the plan required under the 2012 framework. But we do ask you formally to record the relatively constrained opportunity there will have been to interrogate the Garden Towns IDP and viability study, and the inappropriateness in consequence of the Council invoking paragraph 57 at the application stage on the basis of that very slight opportunity that we will all have had at the examination to scrutinise the Garden Towns IDP work. So we associate ourselves with what Mr. Barber said earlier.
Mr. Hill, what would be the consequence of if I took that position when planning applications came to be determined under the new framework, which would be what they'd be considered against?
Ma'am, I think it would mean... I hope that wasn't me. I think it would simply mean that the council would not be able to simply point to paragraph 57 and say, no, this is all fixed. There would have to be a degree of flex, which would take account of the fact that only a very limited opportunity had been afforded to scrutinise the list of requirements that might be placed against the Garden Town allocations.
Would that position be preferable to allowing more time for scrutiny through the examination process?
I'm anxious about just how much time one would need to allow, ma'am, and the need to press on with the plan and to conclude your examination to get some houses built. We'll have to wait and see what emerges midway through April. But it seems to me that if you were to effectively try to treat this as an examination that would allow paragraph 57 to be invoked, then we might have to allow a considerably considerable extra amount of time, both at the examination and, of course, consultation outside the examination, which I think could involve many months of delay, and that would be undesirable.
Thank you. Give the opportunity for the council to come back, and then, as I say, I have some quite specific questions about particular junctions and the transport corridors. We'll deal with those next.
Thank you, Madam. I think we may need to call forward other colleagues for dealing with those questions you've just mentioned. But in terms of what we've just heard, there are a few points I'd like to make, if I may. If I start with Mr. Hill's comments just made, I find some of the comments slightly puzzling. The work that's been undertaken has been developed in close consultation with the promoters of sites around the Garden Town, and it's been made clear to them the purpose of the work. So I'm slightly surprised to hear, I know you don't want to go into the detail of that now, but I'm slightly surprised to hear that. And that's been a process of ongoing engagement where the promoters have seen the emerging documentation in full on more than one occasion. So slightly puzzled by that position. I think it's also worth mentioning that what the new MPPF says and what the planning practice guidance says is not that there will be no opportunities for further viability work to be undertaken. It says that essentially it's paragraph 007 of the PPG. In some cases, the applicant may demonstrate that particular circumstances justify the need for a viability assessment at the application stage. Such circumstances could include, for example, where further information on infrastructure or site costs is required, where particular types of development are proposed which may significantly vary from the standard model of development for sale, or where a recession or similar significant economic change has occurred. Where a viability assessment is submitted to accompany a planning application, this should be based upon and refer back to the viability assessment that informed the plan, and the applicant should provide evidence of what has changed since then. So it's not saying there will be no viability assessment whatsoever, but it's saying that any viability discussions or considerations should be based on the work that's been undertaken. And I'm surprised that is not already acknowledged. I would also like to stress, in relation to some of the other comments that we've heard, that the work that's being undertaken, the Garden Town work, does very much supplement and build on the existing IDP. So it's not bringing out significant new infrastructure projects. It's just providing more detail on how funding will be brought forward, how funding will be apportioned, and the delivery arrangements associated with it. The work is being undertaken by Arup, who are the consultants that undertook the Epping Forest District local IDP. So we have continuity in terms of the work that's being undertaken. I think we all acknowledge that we would prefer the document to be available earlier, but as we've already said, it's not really within the control of Epping Forest District Council to bring forward the document at the time of our choosing. We've had to work in partnership, rightly, with the other 4 councils involved in the project. And I think, personally, I think that the evolution of the document at this stage shows real progress in terms of delivery. And I would hope it would provide greater comfort to those around the table about the requirements that are already set out in policy and in the IDP. I don't agree that the HRA would need to be updated to reflect the IDP, because, as I've said, it's not specific new strategic projects being included. It's very much building on what's already there in the plan and providing more detail on how it will emerge. In terms of linkages through from Latin Priory to Epping, we've heard about concerns about the impact on the roads, and I've already mentioned those, but I just wanted to reiterate that further work is ongoing with the site promoters and with Essex County Council and Harlow District Council officers to assess the most preferable alignment for a new access road into the site, and to consider the implications for traffic generation both in Harlow and in Epping itself, and also to consider how the sustainable transport corridors can be suitably extended to serve Epping as well. There are major constraints on the road, meaning that it's not possible to physically extend the corridor and widen the road, nor would it be desirable to widen the road down to Epping, but there are ways that public transport accessibility can and will be improved, and those projects are being developed by the partners working with the site promoter. I would also say that, again, whilst I appreciate it's not ideal to have new work coming forward at this stage, it is very much common practice and recognises the extent of the work that's being undertaken by the partners of the Garden Town. Just to clarify, there are not multiple new reports coming forward. As has been suggested, there is the 2 reports for the Garden Town, and then there are also the IDP addenda for the rest of the district. So, as I said, I think it's not unusual to have new documentation coming forward, although I appreciate everybody will want a suitable opportunity to review it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think on that note, it's 11:30, so we'll have a break now until 11:45. When we come back, we'll talk about the sort of specific infrastructure listed on the agenda, and I want to be able to conclude issue 3, which concerns policy SP4, before we break for lunch, so that we have the afternoon session to talk about the site-specific issues. Okay, thank you. Back at 11:45. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I think, as I said, I want to get through the rest of issue 2 and issue 3 before the lunch break. So I think for reasons of efficiency now, we'll adopt the approach where I'll hear from the council in relation to my questions on Junction 7A, Junction 7 and the sustainable transport corridors together, and then people around the table will be invited to make the comments that they wish in relation to any of those points. If I just clarify what I'd perhaps be looking for a little bit, where it's not wholly clear from the agenda. So in relation to Junction 7A, just to point out that the council has proposed a modification to the plan in paragraph 27 of its statement, and this is to clarify when Junction 7A is expected to be operational, and to note the importance of key elements of sustainable transport infrastructure being in place in tandem with developments. Now, my question there, I suppose, would be, it may come back to a point that Mr. Dagley was making earlier. I think it would be useful perhaps to identify what those key elements were and whether that should also be clear in the policy, so that it wasn't just the road infrastructure that was coming forward. So perhaps if the council could comment on that. Then someone has raised an issue about the commencement of development being contingent upon the provision of Junction 7A. So I just understand a little bit more about the concern, whether that's something required by the plan. In relation to funding for upgrades to Junction 7, perhaps if you could talk a little bit about the likelihood that funding will be provided through the Highways England Road Investment Strategy number 2, and then the question of whether it is intended that any funding gap should be met by Latin Priory alone or whether the emerging IDP indicates otherwise. And then if we come on to the sustainable transport corridors questions, which I think are fairly self-explanatory. Okay, thank you. Mr. Coleman?
Thank you, Madam. In terms of Junction 7A of the M11 and whether it is a prerequisite for development, Essex County Council, as the local highways authority, is always advised as part of the work to support and underpin the emerging local plans in the Greater Harlow area that Junction 7A of the M11 is required to facilitate planned growth. The Council and its partner authorities across the housing market area recognise this, and therefore it's reflected in the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed between the authorities, which is EB 1201. The Council's position is also set out fully within Appendix 2 to the draft Statement of Common Ground with Essex County Council, and that's ED 10B, page 12. It's also within the Matter 8 hearing statement. This has also been recently supplemented by the summary update to the Statement of Common Ground with Essex County Council, which is EB 1508. And I'll just summarise for you the position, if I may. So, Epping Forest District Council agrees that the provision of Junction 7A of the M11 is a prerequisite for the development of the strategic Harlow and Gilston Garden Town sites, and has proposed the following additional text after paragraph 2.117 of the plan to clarify this position. I'll just read it briefly, if I may, to give context. So the growth plan, this is the addition to the text. The growth plans for the Garden Town require the implementation of a new junction, Junction 7A on the M11. This new junction is planned to be operational by 2023, prior to the occupation of the strategic developments. In order to maximise the promotion of use of sustainable transport measures, it will be necessary for key elements of sustainable transport provision to be available when new developments are first occupied. This will be required in order to prevent the establishment of unsustainable travel behaviour and to provide viable alternatives to private car use. The Council will secure the necessary measures through the use of planning obligations or other relevant mechanisms as appropriate. And to supplement that, you asked in your introduction there what those key measures might be, what the key elements might be of sustainable transport provision that need to be available. It's very difficult to be specific at this point in time. It could take the form of alternative interim arrangements or other interim approaches, which we'd expect to evolve through the master planning work and through further work being undertaken jointly with Essex County Council. But I think the County Council may be better placed to comment on whether it's possible to be more specific at this stage. In terms of the next issue, funding of upgrade to Junction 7 of the M11 and the cost to be borne by Latin Priory. Through the further work being undertaken by the Council and the Garden Town partner authorities as part of the Garden Town IDP, it is recognised that contributions towards the minor upgrades to Junction 7 of the M11 are required to support the delivery of growth, and that contributions will be required from a range of sources and sites. So the situation has moved on from the IDP itself. So developer contributions will therefore be apportioned, meaning that the full cost will not fall upon proposed development at Latin Priory. And as you indicated in your introduction, there is also the possibility that funding could be provided through Highways England. I haven't got the latest position on that available, but the County Council again may be able to provide further details. Yeah.
So at what stage would you propose a modification to reflect that?
In terms of the changes to the funding arrangements?
Yes.
I don't think it requires a change to the plan. I think it will be a change within the IDP, unless I'm mistaken. I don't think the plan makes it clear that Latin Priory will need to fund the entirety of it. In terms of the sustainable transport corridors, the Garden Town authorities share an ambition to achieve 60% mode share for active, healthy, sustainable travel in the new Garden Town communities, and a shift to 50% mode share across the wider Garden Town, as set out in the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town Draft Transport Strategy, that's EB 1408, and also the Sustainable Transport Corridor Study, which is EB 1407A. The proposed north-south and east-west sustainable transport corridors represent a key project underpinning the future delivery of the Garden Town. The corridors will provide a network which connects the existing and new neighbourhoods, together with local employment opportunities and Harlow Town Centre. The corridors will link to key transport interchanges to provide easy, efficient and safe sustainable travel via walking, cycling and bus rapid transit, to ensure that modal shift is achieved. The further work being undertaken by the Garden Town partner authorities to produce the infrastructure delivery plan and viability study considers in further detail the apportionment of developer contributions required to deliver the corridors and the associated impacts on the viability of site delivery. Developer contributions towards the corridors as a whole are to be apportioned appropriately and proportionately, ensuring that the viability of development will not be threatened. It is therefore not the case that Latin Priory development will be expected to deliver the southern corridor. Rather, the Latin Priory development, together with other planned Garden Town communities, will be required to contribute proportionately to the project. External funding sources will also be crucial in ensuring the timely and potentially accelerated delivery of the corridors. Funding is being sought in order to forward fund key infrastructure across the Garden Town in the form of a bid to the Housing Infrastructure Fund. This builds upon the Garden Town status provided by the government. It is recognised that the sustainable transport corridors will be delivered alongside the development of the Garden Town communities. Through the Epping Forest and Essex County Council Statement of Common Ground Summary Update, it's a bit of a mouthful, EB 1508, and the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town Memorandum of Understanding in Highways and Transport Infrastructure, which is EB 1201, it is recognised that the full delivery and completion of the proposed sustainable transport corridors could not reasonably be required upon commencement of proposed development. Instead, at the point of occupation, not commencement, adequate availability of sustainable transport options, such as passenger transport services, cycle and walking infrastructure, etc., will be required in order to avoid the establishment of unsustainable travel behaviour amongst new residents and to provide viable alternatives to private car use. The Garden Town partner authorities will secure the necessary measures through the use of planning obligations or other relevant mechanisms as appropriate. It's important to clarify, however, that the full sustainable transport corridors should be in place prior to the end of the plan period in 2033. The Council, in agreement with the other Garden Town partner authorities, consider that the inclusion of safeguarded routes in the local plans is crucial to support the delivery of the sustainable transport corridors. The indicative routes proposed for inclusion are agreed by the Garden Town partner authorities to represent the most appropriate and deliverable routes, informed by the available evidence, which includes the Sustainable Transport Corridor Study, EB 1407. It should also be noted that further work is being progressed by the authorities to support the delivery of sustainable transport corridors and the definition of the routes themselves. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Sprunt.
Thank you, ma'am. I think it's useful just to start with junction 7A and just give you an update where we are, just to give you some confidence in terms of the delivery of that junction. We are currently out to tender on that, and we are expecting returns later this year for assessment. The timescale for that, for delivery, has actually come forward very slightly now to the end of 2022. So that's some good news in terms of delivery of homes. As David has said, in terms of prerequisite of development, it's very much a prerequisite of occupation as opposed to necessary start of infrastructure works associated with those developments, which clearly could take place as long as it doesn't impact directly on the works that are ongoing at the junction itself. So there's a slight change in terms of that, as Mr. Coleman has indicated. So that again is some good news and some movement forward from where we were originally. In terms of funding of Junction 7 of the M11, the cost of 5 million is for an interim proposal. It's not the long-term proposal that's required, as we've indicated, by the end of the planned period. And as Mr. Coleman has said, this would be proportional to the various developments. Obviously, it's probably more critical to the Latham Priory development due to its proximity, but there would be an apportionment across the major developments across the town. In terms of the more major scheme, RIS2 is in fact unlikely. It's not one that we've been made aware of as being included in Highways England's programme for RIS2, but it's more likely to be a RIS3 scheme, which would be 2030 onwards. So again, it would still fall within roughly the time periods of the local plan in terms of its delivery. We see that as an end of plan period requirement anyway. So as long as the interim improvement is there, it will buy enough time for that improvement to come along in due course, and that's a much bigger improvement. The initial work was around about somewhere between about 35 and 40 million, so it's a much bigger scheme than the one being proposed as an interim scheme. The sustainable transport corridors are very much a key piece of infrastructure. As Mr. Coleman's indicated, they are a way of achieving the level of growth that's proposed within the Garden Town. It's not sustainable to continue building major junction improvements across the town. There isn't the space or the funding to do so, and they're not desirable either in terms of the scale of improvement that will be required. So sustainable corridors are going to be a very key piece of infrastructure, and they will need to be in on day one in terms of some form, as has been indicated, be that public transport running from first occupation to bus, walking and cycling routes, as well linking into the current infrastructure within the town. So we wouldn't expect the actual corridors themselves to be fully constructed at that stage. They would come during the period of the local plan, but as indicated, by the end of the local plan we would want to see those in place to try and meet those what are aspirational targets of 60 and 50% for sustainable transport across the Garden Town. We believe they are feasible and viable. There has been work done by consultants looking initially at the outline feasibility, and more work is currently ongoing in respect of those routes, and they are confirming that that work is correct in terms of what has been identified. So therefore the map and the safeguarded routes as per included in the plan are the ones we would wish to see move forward and be incorporated.
Thank you. Perhaps you could just come back to the question, I think in relation to Junction 7A and also the sustainable transport corridors. We've heard from the council that it's not necessary to have absolutely everything in place early on, but these other sort of key elements of the sustainable transport infrastructure are important as we go along. And I asked the question, is it possible to be more specific about what those are, or how will they be identified? How can we be confident that they are being proposed and that they are in place as part of the planning applications if we can't be specific about what they are in the plan?
At this stage, it's not possible to be specific about which elements of those would come into being first, because we have so far been looking at the whole corridors, not at specific elements of those corridors. But that's a piece of work that we would work with developers as individual sites come forwards to look at which pieces are key to providing the best sustainability from any one of the sites. So we'd be looking at providing elements, not the whole corridors. And we feel that's perfectly doable in terms of individual sites, or indeed as all the sites come forwards, looking at pooling funding to achieve those. As Mr. Coleman's mentioned, we do have the HIF funding which is coming forward, and that will provide a rolling fund as well, which will allow us to implement schemes as well. So that gives us a backup to that whilst funding is potentially coming through. And as is always the case, we have historically been very successful putting bids into government for other funding pots as and when they come forwards to enable us to bring forward schemes as well. So we see the Sustainable Transport Corridor as something that would come forward as early as possible through all those different funding sources, be that developers, be that through the rolling HIF, or through other funding sources through central government.
Mr. Coleman, are you able to point to where in the plan that situation is reflected, so that there can be sort of confidence through the policy that will be given adequate attention?
I may need to come back to you on that, because I think it's wrapped up in some of the proposed amendments that we're planning to make as well. So
Okay, well, that was going to perhaps be my overall question at the end. If there are amendments to the plan that are required to reflect sort of what we're hearing, then
I think it's a combination of various policy requirements, but also taken together with some new amendments that we've agreed with the County Council.
Okay.
That may be easiest if we could come back to you, if that's okay.
Thank you. Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Mum. Just really probably to help you in your last question, we're envisaging those sorts of issues to be flagged through the preparation of the strategic master plans, both in terms of timing, phasing, and delivery of early sustainable transport. And I think that's an appropriate vehicle for those matters to be explored. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
No, thank you. The 2 points, really. First one, there's reference that the funding of Junction 7 wasn't just to be funded by Latin Priory, but from funds from other developments as well. I'm just slightly concerned that won't suck infrastructure funds away from other places such as Epping developments, which then don't get their infrastructure. I wasn't clear on how wide that contribution was going to be. Was it just from other developments around Harlow, or was it for developments all across the district? A bigger point is I couldn't see anything in the plan which showed contingency planning for motorway closures. One would hope that perhaps having additional junctions might tend to reduce closures because it would reduce accidents on already over-busy junctions. But we seem to get closures through accidents, repairs or congestion, which cause Epping to gridlock 8 or 10 times a year, I'd guess. With additional development here, additional housing, additional traffic, that can only get worse. And it doesn't just raise questions about people's convenience, it raises questions about the economy, if people can't go about their business, and indeed even safety if key services can't get through to people. And Epping really does get very gridlocked. So does parts of Loughton, Rectory Lane, and parts of Waltham Abbey. Whenever there's a major problem on the M25 or the M11, the roads lock up, and we think there should be some sort of contingency.
Thank you. Mr Spencer?
Thank you, Ma'am. My client's position is that the commencement of development shouldn't be contingent on the prior provision of Junction 7A. Although they accept that Junction 7A is a prerequisite for the full development of the new Garden Town communities as a whole, alternative measures could be provided to support the commencement of a first phase of development east of Harlow, if necessary. That said, the proposed modification at para 27 of the Council's hearing statement doesn't explicitly prohibit commencement ahead of Junction 7A. It only states that Junction 7A is planned to be operational prior to occupation. So the modified wording appears to contain sufficient flexibility, and that's something that's now supported by my client.
Thank you. That was my question. Were you concerned that there was anything else, that there was anything within the policy that made it contingent commencement? Sorry, you know what I'm asking. My words are on the wrong way.
I think now that the wording in the paragraph has been amended, I think we're now satisfied that there's flexibility.
Okay. Thank you. Mr Jackson.
Thank you, Madam. If, as Mr Sprunt said earlier, these sustainable transport links are key to the development, then it must be, in my view, unsatisfactory that we have no idea of their route or nature. Because, in particular, from Latin Priory to the centre of Epping, I'm very familiar with the existing road, I'm familiar with what is around, the built-up areas, and in fact, at one point, the forest on both sides of it, the Epping Forest. So we cannot really understand how that impacts or otherwise on Latin Priory, for example. I speak not of any of the others because I don't know enough detail.
Thank you. Mr Dagley.
Thank you, Madam. 3 points. Just to come back on what Essex County Councillor David Sprunt was saying about specifying elements. I think the Habitats Regulation Assessment will need specificity about those elements because it needs confidence to rule out adverse effects on integrity. So we do need that, and I repeat the issue about an iterative approach to the HRA to take on board the changes to the IDP. Moving on to that, the key thing about the sustainable corridors does seem, as I said earlier, that they do seem to be serving within Harlow and reducing or making that modal shift within Harlow, particularly to employment sites within Harlow. So the issue of out-commuting, though, remains, and a point I didn't make earlier, which I wanted to make at this juncture, is that one of those issues seems to be that to reduce the out-commuting impacts south from Harlow towards Epping, and probably more important than that south route to Epping is the route across to the Harlow railheads of Harlow Mill and Harlow Town. Now, the big concern the Conservatives have, that I have on this, is that that rail track is a two-track rail only. And the four tracking that's been talked about linked to Crossrail 2 up to Broxbourne is not linked to come forward to Harlow. I understand there's some restrictions around Harlow, but in discussions that we've had at a cross-border meeting, the Six Authorities Liaison Group, when a Crossrail 2 representative was there to answer questions, it was clear that there is space to accommodate at least bypass routes. So in other words, the two-track can accommodate more trains and more times, and I think that's key because clearly if more people are making a way across on these sustainable corridors to those railheads, they've got to be able to serve extra people, and there's limited capacity because they're two rail and also the Stansted Express. So I think that's really key to explore, and I would say that from our point of view, as sort of lay people in traffic, it seems to me that that should be as explored as actively as any sustainable south route from Harlow to Epping. The final point's a smaller point, but just coming back to the issue about Rye Hill Road and the connection of Latin Priory to Junction 7. On the maps in EB 1408, it shows it connecting to 1393. The only issue I want to check on that is whether it can just go straight to Junction 7. I have asked this of the County Council before some time ago. In other words, there could not be a right turn onto the 1393. In other words, the traffic is directed onto the Junction 7 to then go around the roundabout, hopefully to join the M11 rather than to be headed through onto the forest. I'm not sure how practical that is, but that will be an important point to know, because at the moment it's clearly joining the B road rather than the Junction 7 directly, which gives people more choice to head south rather than to join the Junction 7 and the M11 itself. And that's everything. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you. Mr. Leverett.
Yeah, we keep hearing this as a key element in terms of the sustainable transport route. But the majority of it runs through Harlow. It runs north-east and south-west. West to east and north to south, right the way through Harlow. And with the memorandum of understanding with the local authorities, you would have thought that there would have been some consultation with residents as to they've got a sustainable transport route running past their back door. There's not been one consultation with any residents within Harlow on this sustainable transport route. In fact, a lot of them don't even know what the term means, so that's how bad it is. So we're finding it that people are getting really hot under the collar, one might say, about the fact that there's been lack of consultation on this particular issue. The question of consultation with the Latin Priory and the Catherine's, the Harlow West sites, they have not also been consulted either over the cross-border. So these are major issues in terms of the fact that they're going to be affected by the infrastructure from these particular developments.
Mr. Belton.
Thank you, Ma'am. Just a quick observation, if I may, on the timeline for Junction 7A. It may be something you've already spotted, but the assumption that the junction needs to be improved pre-occupation and that the junction will be opened end of 2022, that's precisely the time that the housing trajectory is assuming that the garden community sites will begin to be occupied. So it seems that we're planning right up to the buffer here in terms of the trajectory, and it could well be possible that you have houses built and ready to be occupied but have been held while the junction is being completed. That, to us, doesn't feel like there is sufficient flexibility, and any delay in the junction works will obviously have a significant impact on the housing trajectory that's set out in EB 410B.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, are you waiting to... No, okay, thank you. Just a couple of things perhaps for you to come back on specifically, and then anything else you want to, Mr. I have a question for Mr. Sprunt and also Mr. Coleman. Perhaps first of all, I mean, Mr. Jackson asked for some clarity over the nature of the sustainable corridors. I know you've said a bit about it already, but can you just give us an idea of what they'll look like, what they'll contain, just exactly what they are?
The actual corridors will vary from route to route. Some of them are ones which will just follow existing roads and be widened into existing bits of verge and so on along the edge of those roads. Some of the corridors already have some significant bus priority as well, so obviously use would be made of that. So they will vary quite considerably from location to location, but they will be primarily bus priority and segregated walking and cycling routes. I think we term them rather like the sort of motorways of bus priority and cycling and walking, these being the really big pieces of sustainable infrastructure. So you would expect them to be high quality with very limited congestion impacted on them as part of their routes. The one corridor which is slightly different is that which goes down to Latin Priory, which would run through the Green Wedge that runs to the south of the town. So that would be very different to what might be considered a more traditional type approach, which, as I say, is within the existing highway. And that would run on a segregated piece of road which would be reserved solely for the purposes of buses, not just the rapid transit type buses, but also other service buses would be able to make use of those corridors as well. And much has been made of the route down to Epping, where there is an existing bus service which makes use of existing roads, but could make use of that corridor if that were to be seen better for that route. So that would be part of the route which an Epping bus would make use of. In that particular corridor, there would also be a segregated walking and cycling route. Part of that is already in place, but that would be upgraded to the full specifications that we're looking at, which is largely a 5 metre wide walking and cycling route. The bus corridor would be a minimum of about 6.75 metres wide to allow 2 buses to pass adequately along that corridor. So it would be a separate route on that particular corridor. But I say all the others would, I suppose, in essence, be much more traditional in terms of their design, albeit a much higher quality than has been traditionally provided.
Thank you very much. Also, Mr. Dagley has raised some sort of quite detailed issues about routing and things like that, which to be honest, I'm not familiar enough with the routes to say that I'm aware of all of those. I'll be quite honest about that. But I just wonder whether there's a specific sort of forum for discussion for these matters, or how these types of detailed issues would be resolved.
So for the infrastructure associated with the Garden Town communities directly, the council and the promoters are undertaking strategic master plans, and there will be ongoing engagement, and there will be formal public consultation as part of the production of those master plans. Council has set out, together with the other Garden Town authorities, some quite stringent requirements for consultation and engagement that needs to be undertaken through that process. That's set out in the strategic master plan briefing note. I'm afraid I don't have the reference to hand. So that's the most obvious way. In terms of purely sort of changes to the highways network that are outside of the master plan areas, I might have to ask Mr. Sprunt to confirm the usual arrangements for that.
And apart from the general sort of Garden Town consultation, obviously with most of the infrastructure that we're putting in, there is a need for sort of more formal consultation that's required through the promotion of traffic regulation orders associated with the infrastructure. So obviously that would be another further opportunity to look at the real detail side of it. So it'll be very much a staged approach where we'll be looking at the feasibility and consultation on that to get feedback on that, and then we'll move more into the more detailed design, and that will feed then into the traffic regulation orders, which people have a formal opportunity to respond to, and that has to then be considered formally and a response made associated with that. So it's not just a one-stop shop. There will be opportunities for people to feed back into the process.
Thank you. And I suppose a similar process would apply to the comments made by Mr. Smith about motorway closure contingencies and things like that. That's something would be considered through that process.
I mean, none of the proposals we're putting forward here are specifically aimed at dealing with the M11. Obviously, that's Highways England consideration as to how that operates. There will be some benefit by putting in junction 7A, in that obviously if an accident happens between 7 and 7A, the diversion route is much shorter than it is at the moment, so you're not locked between the two junctions. But what we're looking at is not trying to address motorway issues here. That lies with another authority other than ourselves.
Thank you. Can I just ask for, before I come back, and these will be the last 2 points, perhaps, or 3 points, the last 3 points we take on this before we move on to issue 3, but could I just ask Mr. Coleman to perhaps come back on the point raised over here about there having been no consultation on the proposed routes for the sustainable transport corridors. Is that correct? And on that basis, would it be appropriate to modify the plan to safeguard specific routes at this stage?
There has been consultation undertaken by the Garden Town as part of consultation on the spatial vision document. There is also a draft transport strategy which is being produced. That's not yet out to consultation, but will be shortly. So there are opportunities in terms of what's been put forward for people to be aware of and to comment on what's being proposed.
Okay, as I say, the last few comments on this point then, please. So if we take Mr. Taylor first, and we'll go that way.
Yes, I think the...
Hold on, just pause 1 second, because I've reached a milestone here. that on day 8 my notepad is now full up, so just bear with me for one moment. Right, it shows you how many notes I make. Anyway, carry on.
Yes, I think the comments made by the gentleman across here from Essex County Council are probably the most concerning things I've heard this morning. It does beg the question as to who's going to carry out the consultation with regard to the sustainable corridors. Clearly up to now, Harlow Council haven't done that, neither has Epping Forest Council done that, and neither has the Garden Town group done that. So it begs the question who will do that and when, because surely all of this should have been done prior to these hearings during the earlier consultation periods.
Mr. Stamp.
Yeah, I've got a number of concerns about this, and it's not just leaving consultation to later. Some of these are fundamental issues. I'll try and do them briefly. It's footway, cycleway, Latin Priory to Rye Hill Road and on to B1393 and the nature of that road, and sustainable transport corridor potential from Latin Priory via the Link Road to the B1393 south to Epping and the tube station, which a lot of people use. On these, I mean, there are different documents, as I said, both produced February, Transport Strategy and Vision, showing different things. I'll try and suss them out. A cycle super greenway in the Vision from Latin Priory to Epping Tube Station. Now that's got to get out on the site, onto Rye Hill Road, heavily used by traffic, narrow road, passing is difficult, speeding, no lighting at all. There was a proposal perhaps to close that road at the junction with the B1393 when it gets down, which rather to me ignores the 15 or 20 houses which actually access on that road, dust carts, delivery lorries, etc. I can't see, without traffic being removed, that being a safe footway or cycleway, and I can't see how traffic's going to be removed from that road. There might be an alternative with a link road through from Latin Priory, but I can still see that road being used once the other road fills up, as the transport strategy recognises. You build roads and they tend to fill up. Once you actually, if you manage to deal with the Rye Hill problem, once you get on to B1393, I really wouldn't advise cycling on that road unless you're a keen cyclist. We see some of them in Lycra around through the forest. They're almost professional cyclists. They know what they're doing. They know how to handle cars. For any normal member of the public, which is going to be the vast majority, I really wouldn't suggest using that road. I use it frequently, and I wouldn't dare cycle on it. If you're trying to use that as a new improved pedestrian and cycle link, which is what the transport strategy draft says, no. I mean, if you get down the Rye Hill bit, and you get onto the B1393 and you're heading towards Epping, the road, as I say, is not good for cyclists. It's certainly not for pedestrians. The footway, normally on one side of the road only, is maximum about ½ a metre. It's been encroached on by the vegetation, and there's not much space to enlarge it. And sometimes it's one side, then you have to cross the busy road to get to where the footway starts the other side, still very narrow. Whatever amount of consultation anyone can do, I just don't see that as being anything like a realistic proposition. It just won't work. As the Epping Society did point out about cycling, if anyone wants to try some of these routes, they'll lend a bicycle plus some children and some shopping. Okay, that route probably wouldn't be that, but you get the gist. Some of these seem to be devoid from reality. And I really am concerned that people are seriously suggesting that kind of a route as a practical option for active modes of transport between Latin Priory and Epping. Which worries me about, perhaps that's the scattiest bit of the plan, but it does worry me what's going on. In terms of this sustainable transport corridor potential extension, which is going on the transport strategy from Latin Priory to London Road and to Epping. Okay, on the Vision, it's got a bus down there, but not from Latin Priory, it hasn't. It's going from Bush Fair. So I don't know which one of those. They're both February, so don't know which one of those to believe. That is a potential extension. I've already said about how people in Latin Priory, more than any of the other garden communities, I like to use their cars, particularly if they're going towards Epping. Yes, there is a bus service from Harlow Town to Epping Station. This is a potential one. It's not even a required one. And I can see, in the absence of feasibility or viability, or even which transport routes, which bus service it's going to be, or better than that, we don't know which of those are going to be feasible or viable. I can see that the developer of Latin Priory will obviously want to put the link road in, which I actually don't think is necessary. We might come on to that later this afternoon on such specifics. They'll want to put that in. They also want to get some employment on there, and it raised the Greenbelt issues we'll come on to. They'll be required to contribute something towards the north-south public transport corridor. Once you get all the other Section 106, school places and really necessary things, I wonder, we don't know whether there's going to be any money left in that development, and we don't know how much it was sold for. It was bought some time ago before the planning requirements came out. So we don't know where that sustainable transport corridor potential is just potential some time way in the future, or going to happen at the commencement of a point of occupation, which is the point made earlier, quite right, to encourage sustainable transport behaviour. But if this thing is something might happen 10 or 20 or something years hence, it's not going to change that behaviour. It's going to reinforce the behaviour of people in that area who will be dependent on cars. The other thing about Southern Way and a transport corridor, I think I'll leave the detail matters after, because it impinges on the landscape and some other things.
Okay, thank you. And last point from Mr. Jackson, please.
Thank you, Madam. I'm not going to belabour the point. I'm merely going to accept that that's useful help. And Mr. Sprunt's answer was good. I want to add something that hasn't been covered, which is that the B193, the road south from Junction 7, is an ancient road. It was originally designated in my time the A11, and it is the only road, once you start going south of Junction 7, to reach Loughton. There is no exit on the M11 at the junction at Loughton to south-going traffic. Only north-going can you join or leave. So people are not only wanting to go to Epping, they're wanting to go south of Epping to Loughton, Buckhurst Hill and Woodford. Those are big, big areas.
Thank you. Okay, does the council want to have a final say on those matters?
Thank you. It's just one point, Madam. Just in terms of consultation on the routes, would it just be useful to clarify what I said before? So the partner authorities of the Garden Town consulted on the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town vision, and that was consulted on in all three district areas. That document included indicative routes, which were for the Sustainable Transport Corridor, which were based on the Sustainable Transport Corridor study. Consultation was undertaken in July 2018, which included 4 weeks online and a 2-week exhibition. And as part of that, specific questions were asked in terms of sustainable travel through the feedback forms. Pages 18 to 21 of the Garden Town vision specifically focus on sustainable corridor, the sustainable corridors and movement proposals, and indicative routes are included on pages 4 and 5 of that document. So the vision is EB 1406 and the design guide is EB 1405. Sustainable Transport Corridor is EB 1407.
Thank you. I recognise your board's gone up, but we are going to end that discussion now because it's important to get through the agenda. Hopefully you'll have the opportunity to raise it under the anything else under the site specific. But I do want to move on now to issue 3 in order to allow sufficient time this afternoon to discuss the sites. So issue 3 largely concerns policy SP4 in the plan. Thank you, Ms. Stagley. Okay. So this asks, are the criteria in policy SP4 justified, effective and consistent with national policy? I'll split the points into 2 sides here really. The first concerning the historic environment, which were largely concerns raised by Historic England, and then other issues at the bottom that I picked up from reading these statements as still sort of outstanding issues. And if there's anything else that people want to raise, they can raise it under that part of the agenda. There are some modifications proposed, which are largely what I want to pick up. So, first of all, I think we heard yesterday, if I'm correct, that the statement of common ground with Historic England is signed, is that right?
Yes, madam, that is right. It's on the examination website as document ED24.
And can you just perhaps explain the nature of that document? There's an agreement, but it's the case that there are still some outstanding objections.
Yes, that is correct. There is a statement with 2 appendices. Appendix 1 sets out the resolved objections, and Appendix 2 sets out the outstanding objections.
Thank you. Okay, so if I just run through the modifications that are proposed here, and you can offer comments on them if you want, and then if there's anything else to be said about the historic environment, then you should feel free to do so. So the first one proposed, just try to state. It might be easier if the council does it for me. So there's a modification proposed to SP4C, as you can see there, concerning protecting and enhancing the historic environment. Can you just explain what that modification is and then confirm whether or not Historic England is content with that?
Yes, well, starting off...
Sorry.
Apologies. Council's Matter 8 statement outlines that proposed amendment to policy SP4C little 16 in paragraph 40 of that. This is an agreed amendment included in the final statement of common ground, and the nature of it is essentially to change the wording marginally to say protect or enhance rather than protect and enhance. And to include the natural and historic landscape systems and wider historic environment. If you like, madam, I can read the whole of the amendment, but it is set out in paragraph 40 of our matter statement.
Okay. Does anyone have any concerns or comments on that amendment? Mr. Jackson?
I suppose you might wonder why I keep on about the one site of Latin Priory. It happens to fall in my division, and I have quite a few people asking me to deal with this. I have a general point, madam, and that is I do not understand how we can talk about modification in any of those 3 that are the other 2 below when the site of Latin Priory is literally littered with historic remnants, and the Essex historic environment record will show over 60. This is in addition to the listed buildings, the fortifications, the monuments, a Roman road, and so forth. So my question is a very general one. How can you modify, how can you protect and enhance it when it's littered with it? And madam, if I could just add, I did give the full record from the County Council to the District Council and the map on which they are marked.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jackson. We'll ask the council to come back on that general point, but I think we will this afternoon as well perhaps be able to discuss the heritage requirements of the policy in relation to Latin Priory. The next modification proposed is somewhat relevant to that. This is a modification proposed to SP4C 17, which is to require heritage impact assessments to take place at the master planning stage. I'll ask Ms Blom-Cooper to explain that, but just to give a bit of context again, my understanding is that Historic England consider that this heritage impact assessment should have been done to inform the allocations. We've heard a bit about this already in previous sessions, although they don't seem to overtly state that the plan cannot be sound in their absence by reference to any specific harm. But I'd like to take people's views on that. And then just to ask, when you run through the modification proposed, does this reflect the wording suggested by Historic England in its statement? And then this will lead us into this afternoon's discussion. If it is included in policy SP4 and found to be sound there, is it also necessary to include similar wording in SP5 in relation to Latin Priory and Water Lane? So perhaps if I could just ask Mr. Blom-Cooper to run through the modification, perhaps comment on those issues.
Okay, thank you, Madam. I think we have rehearsed to some extent this already about the absence of heritage impact assessments as part of Matter 5. And I think, just to reiterate, the Council don't consider it's necessary to undertake heritage impact assessments as part of the site selection process for the proposed allocations in the local plan. And as we've previously stated, an initial assessment was undertaken through the site selection process, taking into account the presence of the heritage assets and all those that Councillor Jackson has identified when assessing the quantum of development that could be accommodated on the site. So in relation to your specific question now, we outlined in our Matter 8 statement a proposed amendment to the wording of SP4C little 17 to include an additional requirement for the development proposals for all the Garden Town community sites, because I think Historic England's comments relate to all three Garden Town communities, to produce a heritage impact assessment at the strategic master plan stage. And we've set that out in paragraph 41 of our matter statement. The proposed amendment is included within the final statement of common ground. There's been one minor update from that set out in our matter statement. So I will read it in a minute, but essentially we've added in a word considerably before outweigh to take account of the comments made by Historic England. This is nevertheless one of the outstanding objections, and that relates very much to the fact that they are saying that they should have been done before the site selection process, and that's the nature of their outstanding objection. Not an objection to what we're now proposing in terms of wording to put into the policy, if I can put it that way. So the proposed word amendment would read, a heritage impact assessment will be required to inform the design of the Garden Town communities to ensure heritage assets within and surrounding the sites are conserved or enhanced, and the proposed development will not cause harm to the significance of a heritage asset or its setting unless the public benefits of the proposed development considerably outweigh any harm to the significance or special interest of the heritage asset in question. So that is the proposed amendment included in the final statement of common ground, which is ED 24. And the only change from our matter statement to that final statement of common ground is the addition of the word considerably.
Just before we turn to others around the table, the final one there, which I doubt is going to be particularly controversial, but just to give people the opportunity to comment on that as well, that the modification is proposed to add archaeological remains to the definition of heritage assets in the plan's glossary, and that is agreed with Historic England. So I just wanted to point that one out in case anybody wants to comment on it, but if we can take any comments on heritage matters around the table now, please. Mr. Hill.
Thank you, ma'am. Just 4 short points, please. First of all, in response to your invitation to comment, as we read Historic England's position, they don't say that the plan can't be found sound without a heritage impact assessment. That's certainly my understanding and my reading of what they say. Secondly, we as the promoters of the Latin Priory allocation certainly don't object to any of the wording now proposed by the Council in relation to carrying out heritage impact assessment at the master planning stage. That seems to us to be entirely appropriate. Third, it is our view that the evidence base was entirely proportionate The assets are well known, ma'am, and were all considered, as was the record of fines referred to by Councillor Jackson, maintained by the county archaeologist. Fourth and last, ma'am, in relation to Latin Priory and heritage assets, we strongly advise that you go on to site and look closely at where Latin Priory, the building, actually sits. Look at its setting, its open aspect to the south, the extent to which it's hemmed in by an extensive range of agro-industrial buildings to the north, and just understand how remote it is, ma'am, from the area proposed to be developed. And we believe when you do that, you will see and understand and agree with us that what has been done in the assessment of the asset there is entirely proportionate and will allow you to find this part of the plan sound.
Mr. Barber.
Thank you, ma'am. Just to reiterate some of Mr. Hill's comments just now, but also in relation to Water Lane, significant heritage work has been undertaken. That work informed the site selection process both in 2016 and 2018. EB 1500 and EB 805, I think, are the relative respective documents. And we will continue to work through the master planning process to deal with heritage matters. Thank you.
Mr. Smith.
The Epping Society is a bit concerned about the proposal that the council should be able to decide whether damage to heritage assets is worth suffering in the interest of development, which is essentially what was said. And our reason for concern is that we don't think EFDC have got a very good record of identifying and protecting heritage assets in the past. We'd point to Pierce's Bakery in Epping, the Half Moon pub, which definitely contained 16th century elements, which was demolished and replaced by a particularly ugly block of large flats, and other developments which occurred in the area. So while their heart may be in it, we don't think they're doing a very good job of protecting assets or identifying them sufficiently well.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson.
Yes, just to clarify. Oh, I beg your pardon. Just to clarify for Mr. Hill, my reference to artefacts and so forth was not in relation to just the site of Latin Priory. It's all over the proposed site for the development, both the first part and the rest of it. And Latin Priory is just one small part of that site.
Thank you. Did the council want to come back on any of the points raised?
Just to reiterate that all the heritage assets on the site, and indeed all the sites around on the master plan areas, were taken into account when determining the site selection process and also the quantum of development that could be accommodated on sites. And indeed, there are policy requirements to make sure that they're protected under the DM policies, which I know you'll be looking at next week.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to some of the other issues now set out there in my agenda, which I said I've picked up through my reading of the statements. Now, I don't really want to cover bullet point 1 again. I think that would repeat the discussion we had earlier. Does SP4 have sufficient regard for viability? And I think we left that there are changes that will need to be made to the plan. And obviously I need to consider the various points raised either way in respect of paragraph 57 of the new MPPF. So I don't think it's going to take us anywhere to discuss that again now, unless anyone feels very strongly otherwise. No. Okay, thank you. So we'll move on then to someone has raised, you have to forgive me because I can't remember who raised all of these points, but they were raised in the statement. So SP4C3 talks about the inclusion of opportunities for community-led housing development. So first of all, I could just ask the council to explain what that is, and then whoever was concerned about it can tell me why they were. Thank you.
Yes, as been mentioned previously, the Garden Town is being developed along the Town and Country Planning Association Garden City Principles. One of those key principles is the community ownership of land and long-term stewardship of assets. And as part of that, we have explored the potential for community-led housing, which is, as you know, one of the government's key tenets to pursue. So the Council considers that the requirements of policy SP4C(3) are justified in order to support the delivery of a mixture of tenures for new dwellings on those sites. And that responds in particular to paragraph 50, the first bullet point of the NPPF 2012, which seeks to deliver a wide choice of high-quality homes and mixed communities, and to plan for a range of different types of housing. Additional work is being done through the Garden Town and the housing plan to look at the types of housing and how we might do that. But we do think that the strategic master planning approach does provide opportunities to introduce community-led housing solutions to support that delivery of a mixture of tenures and to meet those principles set out in the Town and Country Planning Association Garden Town Principles.
And just for my own benefit, what would it involve happening through the master planning process? Are you talking about having parcels of land set aside, or?
I think that's for discussion with the individual site promoters on the individual sites and with the communities concerned, and will be part of the engagement as part of the master planning process. As you know, it can take a variety of different forms, and there has been some initial work done through a community housing project that was undertaken to look at this, but we need to look at whether what appetite there is amongst local communities to take it forward and in what form it should be.
Is whoever raised this concern present? Thank you, Ms. Spencer.
Thank you, Ma'am. As you may have seen from our hearing statement, we don't believe that the reference to inclusion of community-led housing in policy SP4 is sufficiently justified or clear. In order to provide greater clarity and certainty to the development industry, we very much believe that the proportion of any community-led housing should be based on evidence and set out in the policy. My client doesn't object to the principle of community-led housing. It's a case that we require more certainty, and as I say, I think it's appropriate that there should be a proportion set out in that policy.
Do either of the other Garden Town promoters have a view on that? Mr. Barber, thank you.
Ma'am, again, in our hearing statement, we deal with it briefly. I think the need, coming back to a conversation earlier this morning, I think there needs to be reference to viability. Given that the work is ongoing and there is no clear position on how it will be delivered, I think we need to have some flexibility in that regard.
Mr. Newton.
Yes, thank you. Just briefly, we made a comment on our representations to the submission plan, simply to state that we wanted some clarity on what was meant by community-led housing development. On the basis of some clarification, that is something we could support, but we need a proper definition before we could make that commitment.
Ms. Baum-Cooper, do you think is there anything in the supporting text that clarifies what you mean by that, and if not, could the plan benefit from it? I think I would benefit from it.
We're very happy to take that away and look at it. I think in terms of the detail, obviously that will come through the master planning process, but also the housing plan that I referred to. If you want more details about the work that's being done through the housing plan for the Garden Town, then Ms Hamilton, who's here, can provide you with more information.
Okay. If you can offer anything more about the appetite for it, whether it's sort of justified to include it in the policy, if there's sufficient appetite that it's actually going to happen, and how much of a requirement as opposed to an aspiration it is, perhaps. And I think when you work up your modification for a definition, perhaps you could clarify those elements. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We are currently working, the Garden Town partners are working on a housing plan which will look in more detail at the TCPA principle around the creation of mixed and balanced communities and how the provision of housing within these developments can meet that principle. We are due to talk to developers and the community about the contents of that plan post the local election period. And as part of that, we will be discussing with residents their appetite for community-led housing. I think the way that that can be delivered will take a number of forms, from people wanting to have quite a lot of control over the layout or be involved in the construction of their homes, all the way through to identifying plots for development. And I think what we will do as part of our strategy and our plan is to look in more detail at exactly what the appetite is, working both with developers and our local communities in relation to community-led housing.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to the next item, SP4C Part 4. Okay, so this was a concern that had been expressed about the requirement of that part of the policy for requiring governance and stewardship arrangements to be in place prior to the submission of outline planning applications rather than the determination of planning applications. So I read that again to be not an objection in principle to the requirement, but the timing at which it kicked in. Again, is whoever was concerned here, do you want to explain your concern, and then we'll ask the council. Is that you again, Mr. Spencer?
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you.
it is. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Really, as you described, we don't have an issue with the principle, and indeed my client's supportive of long-term governance and stewardship arrangements. It's just that we don't believe that it's realistic to expect a developer to agree those prior to the submission of an application. I think prior to determination would be a more sensible timeframe.
Anybody else before I ask the council? Thank you, Mr. Newton.
Thank you. Just to say briefly, we concur with the last speaker. There's no objection in principle. It's purely about timing.
Thank you. Ms. Hill.
Just to say, yeah, I mean, I agree. The question is whether or not these will be fit for purpose if they're actually agreed too early in the process. And it would be much better to do it later on where there's more certainty as to what the final development is before putting them into place.
Thank you. The council.
I don't think there's a big issue here because council are proposing an amendment to SP4C little 4 to change the wording from prior to submission to prior to determination. And I think that probably covers off the comments that we've heard. Again, this is a key tenet of the Town and Country Planning Association Garden Town principles, and the Garden Town are working through a stewardship work stream, have commissioned consultants to consider future arrangements and requirements for the maintenance and long-term stewardship of a number of community assets, including green infrastructure, open space and sustainable urban drainage systems and other community facilities, and to propose a model or models that could be used across the Garden Town.
Thank you. Okay, and then moving on to SP4C Part 8. And this again was an objection to requiring adherence to the Garden Town Vision and Design Charter. And I know that this was Mr. Spencer. The developers for the east of Harlow, I think, disagree with certain aspects of the vision and concerning access, I think, and the vision of the hospital. Is that right?
Yes, I think it's important to say we're supportive of the vision and design guide as a whole. There's just a couple of what we believe are inaccuracies in the document. One relating to the likely points of access, which are definitely wrong and are not what we're proposing. And the other is just a lack of flexibility in the event that the hospital decides not to relocate. I appreciate that seems to be less and less likely now, but it's still a possibility. So our preference would really be that the council just update the design guide to address those two inaccuracies. But if that's not possible, then perhaps an amended form of wording could be included in policy SP4 to change from adhere to the Vision and Design Charter to broadly accord with the Vision and Design Charter.
I think, Madam, we've discussed this already before, and we've proposed an amendment to SP4C little 8, that it should be amended to state that proposals should be in general conformity with the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town Vision and Design Guide. And I think that we've previously discussed that.
I think we have discussed that. We have discussed that before. I couldn't remember if it was perhaps it wasn't in the specific context of your concern, but I think there were a few where it was adherence and would be changed. I think that might be a better solution than updating the documents, because there may well be other situations where things move on and it's not going to be exactly as was set out several years ago. Okay, thank you. And then finally on my list, SP4C, what's that, 10, 15, 17, concerning the justification for requiring the highest standards of energy efficiency. Is that Mr. Spencer? Yep, you want to explain that? Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am. It was a general point, really, that we don't believe it's entirely consistent with the government's stated intention that building regs should govern building performance and energy efficiency, with the exception of water consumption. So a possible amended form of wording could be changing the highest standards of energy efficiency to high standards. I think that would be more appropriate.
Mr. Barber.
Just to say that we would support that view. You have suggested amended wording in our hearing statement along those lines. Thank you.
Ms. Blom-Cooper.
We haven't proposed an amendment at this stage. The requirement for seeking the highest standards is recognition that such an approach is a mechanism to meet those requirements, and it applies to all developments, not just residential developments. The section of the policy seeking to achieve the integration of sustainable approaches to support energy efficiency, including those that we've set out in policy DM20, which relates to low carbon and renewable energy, but reflecting the fact that there's obviously greater opportunity within to make such provision on strategic sites. In our view, that approach supports the government's direction of travel, and that's evidenced by the Chancellor's most recent spring statement on 13th of March 2019 regarding the support for small businesses to cut their carbon emissions, and proposals to introduce a future home standard which will mandate the end of fossil fuel heating systems in all new houses from 2025. So ensuring that all new buildings are as energy efficient as possible can make an important contribution to the achievement of cutting carbon emissions. And so we do think that policy is justified.
So again, just so I'm clear, so I can think about it, are you requiring a higher standard in the Garden Town developments than you are in the rest of the district?
No. We might be requiring different requirements, recognising that larger scale developments can deliver, for example, maybe on district heating systems, although I know that's not BRE's favourite approach any longer, but there are economies of scale and what you can achieve on larger developments that you can't on smaller, perhaps on smaller sites. So we will be looking to see what is appropriate in relation to the scale and nature of developments that are coming forward.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Harlow
Inspector.
Council.
I think it was just worth noting that Harlow Council and Epping Forest Council did develop these policies together, and although they're not identical, the principles across the two policies are the same. We agree with all the proposed changes that have been discussed at this hearing session. However, I think it's just worth noting that we are having a Garden Town hearing session for our policy next Friday. And there have been other matters that may be raised and discussed, and potentially further amendments to our policy being made. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that there may be further changes that we will need to discuss with Epping Forest Council to see whether those changes should apply to both policies to ensure consistency.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Ms Hill.
Thank you. Going back to the energy question, whilst we welcome the clarification from the council, with respect, that's not what the policy wording actually says. It does say the highest level, not the highest level possible, depending upon a number of factors. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well that concludes my questions on SP4. Did anyone else want to raise anything on SP4 before we leave? Thank you. Mr. Lilly?
Thank you. Just at a point, I note in the latest HRA, paragraph 5.26, that's document EB 209, there is a reference to policy SP4 and the requirement for extensive areas of green space based on the visitor survey results. The volume of housing is such that in order to be able to rule out adverse effects on integrity, we need confidence that there is adequate green space. And there's very little in SP4. There's lots of general text about garden and quality of green space, but nothing to give confidence of very extensive green space that the HRA has identified a need for.
Okay, to the council.
I'd just refer you to policy SP5, little c, which says that we will seek to meet the infrastructure requirements set out in the infrastructure delivery plan, which includes provision for open space and the specific policies in relation to Latin Priory, little f, little 4, about strategic green infrastructure. Water Lane G, little 3, also requiring strategic green infrastructure. And also east of Harlow, little h, capital H, little 3, which also asks for strategic green infrastructure. So I think we feel that it's adequately covered by that.
you want to comment on that?
Thank you. I was anticipating maybe I'd note in your agenda for this afternoon issue 4 more on Sangs, but then I was just raising that the HRA does identify in relation to SP4, and those policies you've just mentioned come under SP5.
Would there be benefit? Could you see there being benefit? I mean, it might come out of our discussion in relation to the HRA if anything is required. But perhaps if you give some consideration to whether it's necessary as sort of an overarching objective, because that seems to be the sort of purpose, if you like, of SP4.
Happy to take that away and look at it.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your contributions this morning. We're not too far over time, so we'll come back this afternoon to discuss issue 4. Just as a slight change to the agenda, perhaps, is that I've noticed I've asked at the top of the agenda, and I can see what everybody thinks they'd like to do when we get back, but I've asked for a general overview of each allocation, which I thought would be helpful if the council sort of gave a view and then the site promoter gave a view as to where we're up to, and I think that would be useful. It'd be useful for me, but rather than do it at the top and then go on to something else, maybe if we save that to do it in relation to each allocation as we go along, it might well cover a lot of the issues rather than repeat it. So we'll start with employment provision and then these site-specific issues that are common to everything, and then move on to Latin Priory, and there'll be an opportunity for the council to talk about that site and for the promoters before everyone around the table. So thank you very much, everybody. We'll come back at 2 o'clock.